Hi there, and welcome to Ancestral Recall. I'm your host, Elon Kaplan. Ancestral Recall is an oral history web series that explores the depths of 20 years of Magic history for newer players and a walkthrough nostalgia trip for older players. So, today's story looks at Magic's 7th expansion, Homelands. Why listen to my stories? Because my stories are best stories. Homelands, the 7th expansion for Magic, was released in '95 and was sold in 8-card boosters. Now, Homelands had 25 commons, many of them printed with 2 different pieces of art, as well as 47 uncommons and 43 rares. Now, this set was the first set to be released simultaneously in all of Magic's languages at the same time, and it had pre-releases. So that was good. There was also a comic from Acclaim released at the same time that told the key points of the story. Now, this comic was illustrated by my favorite Magic artist, Rebecca Guay, so I'm kind of disappointed that I couldn't track down the copy locally here in Philly. Time for backstory! A few things I should add here about my experiences with Homelands. Now, I personally was playing kitchen table Magic at the time. I wasn't playing in tournaments. I had just gone back to the US from a year of study abroad in Helsinki, Finland to start university. Now, at the time, I was badly bitten by the DJ bug, so I was spending most of my free time on that rather than keeping up with the new Magic stuff. And honestly, Ice Age wasn't that important for me. I didn't care for it that much. I played a bunch of it in Finland, and I didn't think it was a great set. I didn't go back to playing Magic at the local gaming store on a regular basis until '97 or '98, after the major bannings with Saga and Legacy happening. I did play one place where there was a big box draft, and occasionally I played some Vanguard, but yeah, pretty much kitchen table for the most part. Neither my friends nor I bought a lot of Homelands, and honestly, I didn't have a lot of experiences with it. I remember reading the Homelands issue of The Duelist, which had a bunch of fiction and a bunch of profiles on the good cards of the set. Now, The Duelist was extremely supportive of the new set, but hey, of course, it's printed by Wizards. It would be. In fact, Wizards even put a booster of Homelands in the bagged issue of The Duelist, so I think that was the only Homelands booster I ever opened. Now, today I have a substantial collection of cards from the set after buying a few work colleagues' old collections. And yet, only a scant few have made it into my cube. Lore. So, Sarah is a planeswalker, and she meets Faraz, who's also a planeswalker. They fall in love, and then they retreat to Faraz's place, Ulgrotha, which is far, far out of the center of the multiverse. Now, Faraz sets up a force field around his plane, which keeps mages from other planes dragging Ulgothrans off their plane. Now, the Homelands are a bucolic European high fantasy setting, very medieval. Now, the Sengir vampires happen to hail from Ulgrotha, where the Baron and his demented family rule with an iron fist over his kingdom, the Dark Barony. Yeah, that's a sure winner on the tourist brochures. The shamanistic, nature-loving Minotaurs stick to themselves. When Faraz weakened and died, Sarah ran away and formed her own artificial plane as seen in Urza's saga. But the death of Faraz and his ban meant that his creatures were back to being fodder for summoning by those pesky intraplanar kleptomaniacs. Yeah, that's right, this set made us, the players en masse, out as the big bad. Huh. Okay, that's an interesting premise. I personally have no problem with violence involving fictional characters, and Baron Sengir had the indignity of being summoned once, and he vowed to keep his clanmates and family from suffering the same fates. Maybe, it's a noble villain. He was part of the trio setting up the ban on Ulgrotha in the first place. Now, Homelands features a large number of legends for a small set depicting Baron Sengir, the originator of his famous clan, his inner circle. Red gets a number of thieves, and the only human ever to take over the reins of leadership in the Goblin tribe. There's some vampire hunters, and there's a couple farmers. In his Drive to Work podcast, Mark Rosewater recounted how Kyle Namvar and Scott Hungerford designed the set on their own with virtually no feedback from Wizards R&D. Now, the East Coast playtesters and other R&D people were rather resentful when Wizards founder and original CEO, Peter Adkinson, told Namvar and Hungerford that they could design and release a set when they hadn't had the proven track record. These two guys were in customer service, so their jobs took phone calls in from players who wanted rulings. R&D left the set almost entirely untouched from a gameplay perspective, save for adding Memory Lapse to the file. And this was a good call, because Memory Lapse was one of only a very few tournament-playable cards in this set. One could only imagine how good Homelands would have been if it had gone through proper development. But R&D was ticked off with Atkinson giving a valuable release slot to people who didn't understand the key interactions with the game, and so R&D chose to wash their hands of the affair for the most part. They said to Atkinson, "Hey, if you think this set is so great, we're not going to touch it. It's perfect." It was really a kind of passive-aggressive situation. Technically, Homelands is the second set of Ice Age block, though it has utterly no mechanical connection to Ice Age. No snow lands, no snow permanents, no cumulative upkeep. The set got dumped from Ice Age block with the release of Cold Snap to add one more indignity to the set's collection. Now, this set's highlight was from Pro Tour 1, New York in 1996. This Pro Tour required players, who phoned in to get qualified, to have at least 5 cards from each standard legal expansion, and Homelands was in the set, so everyone had to come up with 5 Homeland cards in their decks or sideboard. Sarcastic players called this the Home-Decapped Pro Tour. This inclusion did not go over well with the budding pro community. Namvar and Hungerford did design a flavorful, storied setting with some creative characters. Now, the fantasy tropes were right there and up front, and that appealed to a segment of the Magic community. This set felt like original D&D from the Red Box, a stock, high fantasy, medieval European setting with castles, bandits, sorcerers, clerics, and gothic Uberwald. A lot of early Magic players learned the game at gaming cons, where they were usually doing tabletop games like D&D or Shadowrun or Battletech. So Magic was what you did in between games. Now, did the two designers understand the setting of tabletop gaming? You bet. But they didn't understand what made Magic a good game. The set was super heavy on creatures and had almost no removal. There were a few red zone interactions and not much else. Forget burn spells. They only printed one. It was a 3-mana spell that did 1 damage to all white and blue creatures. That's it. Magic isn't Magic without burn spells. The combat tricks were incredibly weak and few in number. Homelands wasn't designed to be played on its own, sure, so, why focus on draft? But it lacked the common elements that made Magic a dynamic, interactive game that it usually is. In fact, the card that got the most tournament play that engaged players was Memory Lapse, which was just swiped from the Mirage design. Yeah, the designers handed in a set that didn't even have a counter spell. There's only one black spell that destroys a target creature, and it has to be attacking. What's wrong with this picture? Lots of cards had concepts from D&D brought to life in Magic. If you ever played the Paladin in that game and 1-1 in Magic, this was your set. If you wanted to command a clan of gothic vampires, this was your set. If you wanted to steal an artifact from your opponent forever through Ansi, guess what? This is your set. If you love eating kelp, Homelands is your set. You could control simple farmers. These were people of the land, the common clay of the new west of Ulgrotha. Morons. Homelands also had another annoying play element, cards with multiple arts. Now, this wasn't quite as bad as in Fallen Empires, where there were 4 versions of most of the commons, or in Antiquities, where the lands had 3 or 4 different arts, so you always had to be peering to see, what's that card again? But I'm going to give lands slack. Spells, I don't. Having multiple arts on the same card in the same set makes gameplay frustrating. You have to constantly be looking and checking names. This gimmick needs to be saved for special occasions, and Wizards has learned this. Nowadays, alternate art happens on F&M foils or from the Vault remakes, and Homelands wasn't a special occasion for it. Cards of note! Let's start this set review off with black and go around the wheel to blue, okay? So we're going to start off with the Lord of the Night, Baron Sengir. This 5/5 flyer terrorized other flyers because if they got in his way, he'd come out of the fight with not a +1/+1 counter on him, but +2/+2. He could also tap to regenerate other vampires. But that wasn't what you wanted to do when he hit the table. You want to turn him sideways. Alas, his 8-mana casting cost relegated him to casual play. Now, the hilarious part of Baron Sengir is that there were no vampires in Homelands when the set saw print. The legends lacked the vampire tribal characteristic at the time. Since then, they fixed that, but it was a huge error. Isan's Shade is one of Homeland's most efficient creatures, with 5/5 with protection of white for 6. Now, this card actually got some play because it dodged one of the major removal spells, Swords to Plowshares, and you had to bolt it twice. In life, Isan was a powerful paladin and acolyte of Serra who struck down many monsters of the night, but when the Baron slew him, he was brought back and did far more harm than the good he did in life. Irina Sengir, a dwarven vampire, fulfills the tropes of the daughter or bride of Dracula, whichever you want. Now, Irina's color hosing was incredibly mild, turning Circles of Protection Black and Life Force into more expensive, yet still valuable enchantments. Temerium Fiends, the last anti-card printed in Magic. Now, you think the Wizards would have learned their lesson after Ice Age came out? Temerium Fiends is probably the worst anti-card printed because it only steals artifacts. Unless they ante the top card of their deck. So if your opponent has a Mox Sapphire out and say you actually agreed to get them to play for ante because they've just been released from a asylum, you can try to steal that Mox Sapphire. But they can counter that theft by just anteing the top card of their deck, which couldn't be that much worse. I hate talking about ante because ante is just a fundamentally bad mechanic. If a mechanic exists that makes players not want to play the game with something they like because they're afraid someone will steal it, that's negative. And that's the last word you're ever going to hear from me about ante in a long while. Thank God. Chandler and Joven were a pair of thieves, reminding me more of Fafford and the Grey Mouser, a legendary duo from Fritz Lieber's seminal pulp low fantasy short stories. In fact, Lieber's duo really coined the premise of low fantasy. Between these two, no artifact was safe. But these bums only blew up artifacts. They never managed to take anything home. Okay, so at least that keeps them in color. Aladdin, they weren't. Mechanically, they're nothing special, but in terms of flavor, yeah, they're a good homage to an important part of fantasy's history. Aaron the Relentless was a human that got captured by a clan of goblins. They kept torturing the guy, and he kept getting up. He kept taking it. His body kept coming back together, and he just wouldn't stay dead. In the end, his tenacity won the goblins over, and he used his superior mental acumen, although really he was just average for a human, but among goblins, that qualifies as Einstein. But he organized the goblin clan into legendary bandits. Joven's Ferrets. This card has some of the most whimsical magic art of any card, and the ferrets were also a passable one-drop in a color that rarely got them. This is also a blatant reference to the 1982 film Beastmaster, whose lead also used a pair of ferrets to infiltrate enemy compounds. The design of this card led to the Snakes tribe's combat trigger in Kamigawa block. Autumn Willow is actually a really important card in Magic history, as this is the first creature printed with Shroud. Well, kinda. With the green mana, you get to turn Shroud into actual, honest-to-goodness hexproof. This paved the way for not one but two evergreen mechanics. But at 6 mana for a 4/4, green mages weren't actually getting a deal. Autumn Willow did fascinate Johnnies and Timmies alike, but Spike, he knew better. Leaping Lizard. It's odd to see a green card that can jump over other creatures, but here it is. Leaping Lizards was used by the original developers of Magic Online as their logo and namesake, which tells you how little they knew about Magic at the time. So let's face it, if you want to name your Magic-related concept after a card, at least pick a good card. The better the card, the better the concept, I say. The sad part is, by the basic stats, this is actually the most efficient green creature in Homelands. Root Spider. You know this is just a made-up card, right? It doesn't exist. The fundamental nature of Magic spiders is that they can block flyers. They're the original guys with Reach. They made Reach a thing. And Root Spider is overcosted and can't block flyers. Can't block flyers? Can't block flyers? What the hell? It's like Homelands designers wanted to troll me. Well, it worked. You know, I really like Spiders Unlimited, almost as much as John Becker. So seeing this was a slap in the face. I hate this set so much right now. Oh, just thinking about Root Spider. Ugh. I need a break. Okay, 3 hours of Skyrim later, I think I can handle finishing this. Roots. Now, this card's flavor makes sense. The ground growing up from below a creature to ensnare it. It doesn't hit flyers. This card is actually better than Dehydration, the blue analog, since it doesn't have an upkeep cost. Also, I like the old TV miniseries. Want to see Green's killer combat trick? Check it out! Shrink! Yes, Shrink gives a creature -5/-0 until end of turn. Since then, Wizards has repudiated this card by giving instant spells that reduce power to blue. Green gets to actually hit hard. Lost in the Labyrinth, Pinned to the Ground, Avenize, these are all blue things. White also gets this ability as well, with Humble, but really it's a blue thing. But it started in green. Homelands has not one card that gives opponents a poison counter, and yet it has the only card in Magic that removes poison counters from a player, Leeches. Leeches is some sick, twisted criminal mastermind of design that we're playing here to make sure that no one playing Homelands has fun. Ooh, look at this cool card! It doesn't work with anything in the set. Rashka the Slayer could be construed as Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That is, the movie version. Now, Rashka doesn't like creatures of the night, and she can block and kill a Sengir vampire if it hasn't fed before. Still, this is patently underwhelming. Sarah Aviary got completely made obsolete with Avacyn Resword's favorable winds. Now, Sarah Aviary is double the price and boosts your opponent's flyers too. Gross. This is yet another card with a nice concept that got boned by a lack of development. Sarah Bestiary. Worst pacifism ever. The 2-mana upkeep cost is what dashed this spell's hopes. I could go on a rant here about the US's profit-driven prison system, but Sarah Paladin feels like a D&D card. It has the lay on hands ability that Paladins do, and it can give some other creature vigilance, I guess, for 3 mana? Overcosted. Instead of being hampered by an arbitrary must-be-good mechanic, it's instead hampered by just costing too much to play and use. That sucks. Soraya the Falconer has been errated so that she gives all birds +1/+1, not just falcons. This is actually a rather good bird lord. Truce. With cards like this, give me war any day. Who are the fools who ever took life over cards? Giant Oyster was a ploddingly slow removal card. The problem with this guy is that it only latches on to tapped creatures. This is not a great use of 4 mana. Mystic Decree was designed as a complement to Legends Emote, or alternately, Island Sanctuary. Now, with Island Sanctuary, Mystic Decree, and enough counter magic to defend them, I guess white-blue decks could utterly avoid being attacked for the rest of the game. If you want to find a Homelands card playing the Vintage, well, there's one! Merchant Scroll can be used to fetch a Force of Will, Counterspell, or Ancestral Recall. So congrats to the set for one card that saw tournament play across the years. And this set, what does it get? Memory Lapse. That's it. There was an uncommon land cycle with Magic's first tri-lands. Wow, lands that tap for 3 colors! Exciting, right? Well, you get to filter 1 mana into a single color, or you get to filter 2 mana to get that color's allies. Oh, God. Pathetic. These lands were strictly inferior to Shimmering Grotto, a common color fixer that Wizards knows will never be broken and limited. In my cube videos, I talk about how I want my players to work hard to fix their mana, and some people said my cube's non-basic lands were brutal, but believe me, I could have gone far, far worse in terms of brutality. I could have gone to this cycle. I'm a nice guy. The biggest hit of Homelands, and the Home Decapped Pro Tour I mentioned, was Serrated Arrows. This artifact gets to slowly take an offensive line down to size. Even today, these arrows are a prize card on Magic Online. It's available there thanks to Time Spiral's time-shifted cheats. This card dealt with annoying pump knights like Order of Lightbeer, Order of the Ebon Hands, and early Necro decks. If there ever was a card in Magic that had wishful thinking printed on it, it would be Apocalypse Chime. Yes, Apocalypse Chime. This card, in case Homelands is overpowering your kitchen table, it destroys every card from the Homelands expansion. Yeah. Seriously. Before we continue to the final review, let's take a break for The Price is Right. Final verdict. So we've seen Homelands' cards, and I've spent a lot of time pulling out the hits. Now, I want to do this because if I were to do an entire review about the set's misses, it'd come across as pointless complaining, and it isn't giving you any tech. and I'd also be here for another 20 minutes. Now, I want to give him important historical context, but I also want to make sure there's news you can use, something practical that you can take home to make your games more fun. So I don't like to rant. This show is not about ranting, but it's important to understand why Homelands made so many mistakes, and yeah, I can get passionate a little bit about this. But early marketing research WotC had done in 94 and 95 pointed to a few conclusions. Players liked Sarah Angel, and they liked Heirloom Minotaur. They also liked Sengir Vampire. And that pointed to the two early psychographics of Magic players that they found out about. There were people who loved strong art, cool flavor text, and felt a strong connection to the fantasy tropes. We're talking Vorthoses. That explained Heirloom Minotaur's fans, because the stats of Heirloom Minotaur were god-awful. And then there were the fans of Sarah Angel. Now, Sarah had strong art and flavor, but it also had great mechanics. It was a combat all-star, a strong flyer, and it had a neat ability, Vigilance. Sarah Angel even comboed very nicely with Stasis. So Sarah Angel was the card many spikes and people who were in it to win wanted. Now, I don't want to badmouth Heirloom Minotaur anymore, but I have to go back. The stuff that makes it work matters. That art, that durable toughness, and it's stronger than one or even two Banalish heroes together. Opening a Heirloom Minotaur out of an unlimited booster is a positive experience, but it's flash. It's style. It isn't substance. Heirloom Minotaur's 2-3 stats just isn't fun or exciting in terms of creatures on the board. Wizards wants people to stay attached to the game to get a great experience throughout, not just as you open the pack. That's the substance. And without strong gameplay or creative designs that players can actually experience, instead of just staring them at hands because they're too expensive to play, it's a turnoff. Heirloom Minotaur just doesn't do enough. Now, this Minotaur is emblematic of Homelands. In the plainest terms, a Magic set should be something you want to play. It shouldn't be a museum piece or an RPG setting. You can have rich characters in a strong thematic setting, that's cool. It's good fluff for video games. But if you're not making the game fun to play, you're just wasting everybody's time. And that's where Homelands went wrong. The power level was so low across the board, people didn't want to play with these cards. If you were a new player and started off buying a lot of Homelands boosters to start you off, well, you'd have a thematic deck, sure, but you get beaten up at the kitchen table, or laughed at when you went down to your local card shop to try out the first tournaments. This was a disservice for new and experienced players alike. Another thing I've got to point out is that the power level of later sets in the early years of Magic was declining. There was a downward trend. Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, there were some really powerful spells here. Arabians was comparable, but slightly lower in number, but hey, that's because Arabians was a small set. Antiquities had a lot of tools that became really powerful in later years, but in its early days it wasn't able to hit its prime. That's okay, we can wait. Legends had a few very strong cards, and also a lot of garbage. And this Dark was a step below Legends. Fallen Empires, there was a slight increase in power with things like Thalids, Pump Knights, and Hymn to Torak. And Ice Age also had a few very strong cards like Necropotence and more Pump Knights. But Homelands was a precipitous drop in power. Now, the two guys who created Homelands worked in customer service, dealing with the public's phone calls, answering rules questions about Magic. And let's face it, if you ever worked in a call center, you do feel like you have a connection to the user base, and I think that connection was that they knew what cards Magic players said they liked. These two players were able to identify early, iconic cards, and built a vibrant fantasy world around them. Now, the two designers avoided making any really complex, confusing cards, and at the same time, they priced their set so that gameplay wouldn't be broken, which meant that the set utterly failed at pushing the boundaries of the game. I really doubt that these two had to field any questions about the set after it got released, because the cards were simple enough. And maybe they didn't ask questions about it because people weren't playing them. Homelands is Magic playing it safe, and safe Magic isn't really Magic at all. How will Homelands be remembered by people who didn't play it? Well, there are people who see the glass as being half full, and they'll say, "Hey, Homelands, that's a set with Merchant Scroll, that vintage cards that lets me tutor for my favorite instant. I love that card, so the set's great." And these players are entitled to their opinion, sure, but I'll say that a single hit card is not a set in and of itself. The Dark is not great just because it has Maze of Ith and Blood Moon. Fallen Empires is not great just because it has Hymn to Torak. Now, Merchant Scroll, it isn't even that interesting. It just makes other cards outside the set better. If you ever want to build a great backdraft cube, where you give your opponents a pile of cards you drafted and they have to build a deck out of it, Homelands is a fine starting point. But let's face it, good Magic sets make people want to play with their cards. And Homelands cards just don't attract people to playing. And that's why I'm going to give Homelands a 2 out of 10, awful. And yeah, I'm going to come out and say it flat out. This is the worst set in Magic's history. Homelands is the benchmark, the dirt standard, the bottom of the barrel. I firmly believe that there are valuable cards buried in the set, which is why I'm not giving it a score of 0. But like fracking, the process of extracting these gems is so unpleasant and bothersome for the user and their surroundings that I don't think it's worth it. It was a great object lesson for R&D, and you can appreciate Homelands for the learning experience that it was, but guess what? I'm not a designer, and neither are the vast majority of users. And don't even bother drafting it. This 8-card booster format makes it an incredibly unpleasant affair. You never get to wheel anything. Now, the world and setting are quite good, but everything else associated with the set is crap. Prophecy had disappointing gameplay, causing players to mana screw themselves, but at least it got people in the door? Homelands made people walk away from the door without entering, and that's why Homelands is a set that will go down in history as the worst ever. Thanks for watching the show. I'm glad we got through Homelands because I'm not a fan of looking at bad sets. We got through Prophecy last week, which means that we got through the worst. It only gets better from here, folks. Next time, we're going to look at Onslaught, the first tribal set. If you enjoyed this show, crank that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and tell your friends about the show. I appreciate the people knowing about it. I want to get more people to learn about Magic's history, so spread the word. And also, go back and look at my older videos. Thanks for watching. This is Eli Kaplan for Ancestral Recall, signing off. Good games, and good luck.